When General Mark Davis and cybersecurity expert Dr. Evelyn Carter first discovered the strange loop in the skies above the Persian Gulf, they had no idea their lives and the fate of millions were about to change forever. As a C-17 spiraled, uncontrollably, its GPS system hacked by an unseen force, the two experts found themselves at the center of a global conspiracy. Little did they know, their investigation would lead them into a dangerous world of cyber warfare, military deception, and a power struggle between two of the world's most formidable nations, the United States and Iran. What started as a routine flight would soon become the spark that could ignite World War III. On a routine cargo mission over the Persian Gulf, a C-17 jet, part of the United States Air Force's heavy lift fleet, found itself caught in a situation that defied all expectations. The aircraft, a massive transport plane designed to carry everything from tanks to humanitarian supplies, was mid-flight when something went horribly wrong. It was supposed to be just another ordinary operation, loading supplies, flying to a military base, and unloading cargo. But suddenly, without warning, the plane began to veer off its course. Initially, the pilots thought it was a typical technical glitch, something that could be fixed with a quick reset of the systems or an adjustment to the flight path. But as the jet continued to spiral, it became evident that something far more alarming was at play. The aircraft started to behave in a manner that was completely foreign to its design and function. The plane, once steady and predictable, now appeared to be trapped in a bizarre, unending loop in the air. No matter what the pilots tried, they could not break the sequence. The jet's GPS, a critical component for navigation, began to malfunction, completely losing its signal. The pilots, disoriented and frustrated, attempted to recalibrate the system, but the aircraft continued its erratic motions. It was as though the jet had no sense of direction, spiraling in a strange and unpredictable pattern, resembling a glitch in a video game. The crew knew they were in trouble. They sent out an emergency distress signal, alerting base commanders of the unprecedented situation. The team on the ground scrambled to provide assistance, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control as the minutes passed. The C-17 continued to lose altitude and gain speed in its uncontrolled descent. Ground controllers receiving the distress signals were at a loss. They tried to provide guidance, but the aircraft's GPS was completely down, leaving the crew without any sense of where they were or how to regain control. The situation was dire. Everyone knew that, without control of the aircraft, the jet was now a ticking time bomb, hurtling toward a dangerous unknown. Panic spread throughout the cockpit as the crew fought desperately to regain control, but the spiraling loop seemed to be something no one could understand, let alone stop. The plane was in free fall, and nobody knew how it was going to end. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the situation wasn't resolved quickly, the C-17 would crash. What had started as a routine flight was quickly evolving into an unimaginable crisis. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just a technical malfunction. It was something far more sinister. As the minutes stretched on, the situation inside the cockpit grew increasingly tense. The C-17 continued its strange, looping flight path, seemingly under the influence of some unseen force. The crew, experienced and skilled in handling emergencies, were now fighting not just mechanical failure, but something far beyond their control. The aircraft's instruments were unreliable, the radar systems fluctuating wildly, and the GPS, a system that had always been the cornerstone of their navigation, was completely unresponsive. Attempts to reset the systems only brought temporary relief, with the jet immediately resuming its erratic spiral. With no indication of the problem's source, confusion turned to fear. The pilots began to realize that they weren't dealing with a simple malfunction. This wasn't just a glitch in the system. This was something much more dangerous. Back on the ground, military commanders in the U.S. were quickly made aware of the escalating situation. They had been receiving sporadic distress signals from the plane, but the messages were increasingly incoherent, with no clear idea of what was happening or how to fix it. In the control rooms, analysts began to sift through the data, looking for patterns or anomalies in the aircraft's trajectory. The jet had been operating normally before the incident, and there was no indication of mechanical failure. The possibilities were endless, but one stood out: sabotage. The thought was alarming, and as they pieced together the clues, an unsettling conclusion began to form. This wasn't just an accident. It had all the signs of a targeted attack. While military experts scrambled to diagnose the cause, the crew inside the C-17 struggled to keep the situation from worsening. They tried to communicate with nearby aircraft for help, but their signals kept fading in and out. It was as if the very airspace around them had become hostile. Some of the crew members, their nerves frayed, began to question whether the aircraft's communication systems had been compromised as well. Could someone somewhere have taken control of the jet remotely? As absurd as it sounded, the idea of a cyberattack seemed increasingly plausible. If someone had gained access to the jet's systems, they could be using sophisticated technology. The reality of the situation set in. What began as a routine flight had spiraled into an unprecedented crisis, and no one could predict where it would lead. The crew knew they had to stay focused and remain calm if they hoped to bring the situation under control. But time was running out, and with each passing second, the possibility of disaster loomed larger. Every instinct told them that this wasn't just a random technical glitch. It was something far more intentional, and the stakes had never been higher. The aircraft continued to drift aimlessly through the skies, its strange looping maneuvers defying all attempts to regain control. The pilots, their hands shaking as they frantically adjusted dials and switches, had come to the grim realization that they were no longer in control of the plane. The usual protocols for dealing with an emergency were useless here. The GPS, the cornerstone of modern air navigation, was completely offline, and the backup systems were showing no sign of improvement. The crew members' eyes darted to the instruments, then back out the window, hoping to spot something, anything that might give them a clue as to their location, but nothing looked familiar. They had no sense of where they were in the vast expanse of the Persian Gulf, no reference point that could anchor them in the chaos. In the control room back at base, military experts were poring over the data in a frantic attempt to make sense of what was happening. The jet's behavior, which initially appeared to be a technical malfunction, was now unmistakably abnormal. The aircraft was caught in a looping trajectory, spiraling and swerving in a pattern that didn't resemble anything they had ever seen before. This wasn't a malfunction of the kind that could be fixed by simply resetting the systems. The loops were too precise, too calculated. The plane was moving in a way that felt as if it was being controlled. Its erratic motions were deliberate, almost as if someone was taking it through a set of predetermined movements. The investigators quickly realized they were dealing with something far more sinister than a mere glitch. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't an ordinary mechanical failure. The looping wasn't random. It was too coordinated. It was as though someone or something had taken over the jet's systems and was intentionally keeping it on this erratic path. This raised the terrifying possibility that the C-17 had been hacked. Military intelligence scrambled to analyze the situation. The C-17 wasn't just an ordinary aircraft. It was a highly sophisticated machine, part of the U.S. military's global supply chain. The idea that a foreign actor, especially a nation-state, could gain access to such technology was chilling. Could this be the work of an adversary? The looming possibility that this was a targeted cyberattack began to take shape. If this was sabotage, it wasn't the work of amateurs. It was the work of someone with deep knowledge of the aircraft's systems and an advanced understanding of how to manipulate them from a distance. As the situation continued to deteriorate, in the cockpit, the crew began to suspect that their plane had been compromised. This was no longer a simple emergency. They were now facing a far more insidious threat. The realization that they might be at the mercy of a foreign adversary sent a cold shiver through the entire crew. What began as a routine mission had morphed into something darker, something that could have devastating consequences for both the crew and the larger geopolitical landscape. As the C-17 spiraled uncontrollably through the air, military experts on the ground were forced to consider the growing possibility that this was not just a mechanical failure, but an act of foreign interference. The timing and nature of the incident, coupled with the increasing sophistication of modern cyber warfare, pointed to a disturbing theory. Iran might be behind the attack. In the tense climate of the Persian Gulf, With rising tensions between the United States and Iran, the thought of a foreign power deliberately interfering with a U.S. military asset seemed not only plausible, but likely. Iran had been making waves in the world of cyber warfare for years, and this incident bore the hallmarks of a carefully orchestrated attack. The U.S. military had been monitoring Iran's capabilities in cyber warfare for some time. Iranian hackers had been implicated in several high-profile cyber attacks on U.S. institutions and infrastructure, including the disruption of critical energy grids and attacks on government networks. Iran's cyber capabilities were growing at a rapid pace, and experts had long warned that the country could soon target military systems with the same level of sophistication it had used against civilian infrastructure. Now it seemed that the C-17 had become the latest victim in this silent, high-stakes digital war. Military intelligence began to dig deeper into the possibility that Iran had somehow managed to jam the C-17's GPS system, manipulating its flight path. The idea of a foreign power being able to hijack the navigational systems of an American military plane was chilling. If the Iranians had found a way to disable the aircraft's ability to navigate and communicate, they could have rendered the crew powerless, forcing them into a potentially catastrophic situation. The implications were enormous. If this attack was the result of Iranian cyber intervention, it would signal a new kind of warfare, one that didn't rely on traditional weapons, but on high-tech manipulation of military assets. Meanwhile, the C-17 continued its erratic flight. With every loop and dive, the aircraft flew deeper into unknown territory. The crew, struggling to regain control, were completely at the mercy of the systems that were supposed to guide them. As they fought to keep the plane steady, their thoughts turned to the larger picture. If this was indeed a cyber attack orchestrated by Iran, what would be the next move? Would the U.S. retaliate? And if so, how? The possibility of military escalation hung heavily in the air. The Gulf region, already a volatile and tense part of the world, could become the flashpoint for something much bigger if this attack was part of a broader strategy. For the first time since the crisis began, the crew realized that they were not just fighting to keep their plane in the sky. They were caught in a far more complex and dangerous geopolitical struggle. The very act of sabotaging a military asset like the C-17 could be a calculated message, one that would send shockwaves through both U.S. and international intelligence communities. The stakes were now much higher than a simple emergency landing. The world was watching, and the consequences of what happened next could change the course of history. As the C-17 continued its unrelenting spiral in the skies above the Persian Gulf, the tension between the U.S. and Iran seemed to grow more palpable by the hour. Back in Washington, military leaders, political advisors, and intelligence officials were grappling with a rapidly escalating crisis. The prospect of a targeted cyber attack on a U.S. military plane sent shockwaves through the halls of the Pentagon. Every minute that the C-17 remained uncontrollable made the world's military and political leaders more nervous. The possibility that Iran was behind the attack was gaining traction, and with it, the specter of full-scale conflict in the Middle East seemed all too real. As the situation intensified, the U.S. government found itself facing a difficult choice: respond with measured force or escalate further and risk an all-out war. It was in this highly charged atmosphere that former President Donald Trump, who had been watching the situation unfold from his private residence, made an unexpected and dramatic decision. In a move that surprised both his allies and critics, Trump ordered the deployment of 6 B-2 stealth bombers to the Gulf. The B-2 bombers, known for their stealth capabilities and long-range strike potential, were among the most powerful assets in the U.S. military arsenal. By sending them to the region, Trump was sending a bold message to both Iran and the world. The United States would not tolerate any form of aggression against its military forces. The bombers, capable of carrying nuclear payloads, made clear the seriousness of the response. Trump's statement following the deployment was equally definitive. While it didn't directly accuse Iran of orchestrating the cyber attack, it made clear that the U.S. would respond decisively to any threat to its national security. "We will not be intimidated. The United States will defend its people and its interests no matter the cost," he declared, his words reverberating across international headlines. The message was unmistakable. The stakes had just been raised to an unprecedented level. For many, Trump's decision to deploy the B-2 bombers felt like a dangerous gamble. Some saw it as a necessary show of force to prevent further escalation, while others feared that it would only provoke Iran into taking even more drastic actions. Military experts knew that sending such powerful weapons to the region would undoubtedly heighten tensions, but they also understood the necessity of signaling American strength. The deployment of these bombers was a clear indication that the U.S. was prepared to fight back if necessary. Meanwhile, in Tehran, the Iranian government remained tight-lipped about the situation, but the significance of Trump's actions was not lost on them. Iran had been monitoring the skies, and with 6 B-2 bombers now positioned in the region, the message was clear. The U.S. had just made a bold move. Iran's response, if it came, would likely be calculated. The question now was whether they would escalate further, or whether the mere presence of the bombers would be enough to de-escalate the situation. As the U.S. continued to scrutinize the C-17's malfunction and its possible connections to Iran, the entire world watched closely, waiting for the next chapter in this high-stakes drama. The future of the Persian Gulf and the global balance of power now hung in the balance. As news of the U.S. deployment of 6 B-2 bombers spread, it quickly became clear that the stakes had reached a dangerous new level. The global community watched in apprehension as tensions in the Persian Gulf soared. Across the Middle East, political leaders, military analysts, and civilians alike held their breath. While the U.S. was signaling a powerful defense of its interests, the implications of such a forceful show of strength were far-reaching. A response from Iran, whether military or cyber, seemed inevitable, and the possibility of a full-scale confrontation loomed on the horizon. Experts in international relations warned that even the smallest misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences. In the U.S., the Trump administration faced mounting pressure from both domestic and international sources. While some praised the decision to deploy the bombers as a necessary show of strength, others expressed concern that the actions could easily provoke Iran into retaliating, potentially sparking a chain of events that could spiral out of control. The administration's decision to act decisively was a clear message, but it was one fraught with risk. Would the sheer presence of the bombers be enough to deter any further aggression, or would Iran see it as a provocation and escalate the situation further? Meanwhile, on the ground in the Gulf, military commanders and intelligence officers were working overtime to piece together the origins of the C-17's malfunction. The possibility of a cyberattack was still on the table, but as they delved deeper into the investigation, a disturbing picture began to emerge. While the C-17 incident itself had been unsettling, it was quickly becoming clear that the implications of such an attack went beyond a single plane. This could be part of a much larger and more sophisticated campaign, a test of the U.S.'s vulnerability in the digital age. The jamming of the C-17's GPS system might have been just the beginning. Was it possible that Iran was attempting to challenge U.S. military dominance through a combination of cyber tactics, misinformation, and digital sabotage? The world's attention shifted to Tehran, where political leaders were remaining conspicuously silent. While the Iranian government had not yet made a public statement, military analysts speculated that Iran's next move would be carefully calculated. Iran's leadership was acutely aware of the risks of escalating the situation. They knew that even a small-scale military response could lead to a conflict that neither side was truly prepared for. However, with tensions running high, the pressure to act was mounting. Iranian military officials were likely considering their options carefully, weighing the potential consequences of retaliation against the likelihood of further U.S. military action. Back in Washington, military strategists were increasingly concerned about how to prevent further escalation. While the deployment of the B-2 bombers had been a clear signal of U.S. resolve, it had also opened the door to a new phase of confrontation, one where cyber warfare could become just as deadly as conventional weapons. For the first time, both sides seemed to be operating in a space where the boundaries of traditional warfare were being blurred, where a single hack or cyber attack could push the world to the brink of war. As the world waited for Iran's response, one question echoed in the minds of every leader and strategist. How much longer could this delicate balance of power be maintained before the situation spiraled out of control? In the days following the deployment of the B-2 bombers, A palpable sense of unease spread throughout the international community. Despite the U.S. military's show of strength, both sides knew that this was far from the end of the story. The presence of the stealth bombers in the Gulf was a calculated move, one that might have intimidated some, but it also heightened the sense of unpredictability in the region. With the C-17 incident still unresolved and the potential for retaliation from Iran looming large, the situation had become a high-stakes game of chicken. The balance of power in the region was precarious, and every action seemed to carry enormous consequences. As tensions simmered, the investigation into the C-17's malfunction continued to evolve. While the initial focus had been on the possibility of a technical glitch or human error, the mounting evidence pointed more and more toward a targeted cyberattack. Experts in cybersecurity were brought in to sift through the plane's flight data and communication logs. What they discovered was chilling. The C-17's GPS system had been deliberately jammed, and its flight path had been altered using a sophisticated form of electronic warfare that suggested a high level of expertise. This was no simple hacking job. It was a well-coordinated strike aimed at one of the most critical aspects of military aviation: navigation. The scale and precision of the attack made it clear that this was not just a rogue actor trying to cause chaos. It was likely the work of a nation-state with the resources and motivation to carry out such a sophisticated operation. As suspicions began to mount that Iran was behind the attack, military analysts speculated that this could be part of a larger strategy to destabilize U.S. military operations in the region. The Middle East had long been a hotbed of tension between the U.S. and Iran, but now it seemed the battleground had shifted from the physical to the digital. Cyber warfare was becoming an increasingly prominent tool in the arsenal of global powers, and Iran had long been suspected of building its capabilities in this area. For the U.S., this attack was a wake-up call. Military leaders knew that they could no longer afford to overlook the growing threat of cyber attacks. While traditional warfare had long been the primary focus of military strategy, the digital domain was emerging as a critical theater of combat. The U.S. had made efforts to bolster its cyber defenses, but the C-17 incident revealed just how vulnerable even its most advanced military assets could be. With this in mind, the government began to consider the next steps. How could they retaliate against an invisible enemy that operated in the shadows of cyberspace? And if Iran was behind the attack, would they escalate further? Back in Tehran, the government's response to the escalating tensions remained carefully measured. Iranian leaders had likely been prepared for some form of retaliation after the B-2 bombers were deployed, but the complexity of the situation had caught them off guard. The potential for a cyber warfare campaign to escalate into open military conflict was something neither side wanted, but both were now trapped in a precarious standoff. The global community waited with bated breath, aware that this situation was unlike any previous confrontation. Cyber attacks, military might, and diplomatic maneuvering were now all part of the same dangerous game. The world was witnessing the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one where the line between peace and war was more blurred than ever before. As the situation in the Gulf continued to deteriorate, the world was left to grapple with a question that seemed to hang over everything. Was this the beginning of a new chapter in warfare? The notion of a cyber attack as the catalyst for global tensions was not new, but the scale of the C-17 incident had taken it to a whole new level. What had initially seemed like a simple glitch had now evolved into a highly orchestrated act of sabotage, potentially orchestrated by a state actor like Iran. As military leaders and intelligence experts sifted through data, it became clear that this was no isolated incident. The implications were much larger. This was a calculated attempt to undermine the U.S. military's most advanced systems and disrupt its operations in the most sophisticated way possible. While analysts continued to dig deeper into the attack, the real question was how the U.S. would respond. The traditional methods of retaliation, military strikes, air raids, or ground assaults, seemed inadequate for a conflict of this nature. This wasn't a matter of bombs and bullets. This was a fight happening in cyberspace, where control over critical infrastructure could be lost without a shot being fired. The United States had a robust cyber defense network, but the attack on the C-17 exposed vulnerabilities that no one had fully anticipated. If the U.S. military's most secure systems could be compromised so easily, What did that mean for the nation's broader defense infrastructure? In Washington, President Trump and his advisors huddled in secure locations, consulting with military experts, cybersecurity specialists, and international allies. The option of retaliation was on the table, but the path forward was fraught with risks. Iran was no stranger to using asymmetric tactics in its dealings with the U.S., and cyberattacks were part of its broader strategy of warfare in the 21st century. The situation called for a new kind of response, one that considered the digital battlefield as much as the physical one. At the same time, diplomats and negotiators were urgently trying to keep the situation from escalating into an outright military confrontation. Behind closed doors, representatives from multiple nations began to communicate with both the U.S. and Iran in an effort to calm tensions, but the clock was ticking. Every passing hour without a resolution brought the risk of miscalculation. If Iran misinterpreted the presence of U.S. bombers as an act of aggression, they might retaliate in kind. If they chose not to act, the United States could view their inaction as weakness, opening the door for further U.S. military intervention. The Iranian government, for its part, remained tight-lipped about the unfolding events. The silence was strategic. It wasn't just about avoiding a rash response. It was about weighing their next move carefully. They understood that in the new age of warfare, every move had consequences, and every cyber attack could be countered with another. The threat of escalation was never far from anyone's mind, and Iran's leadership knew that the United States, with its vast military might and advanced cyber capabilities, could easily push the conflict into a dangerous territory. As the world held its breath, the tension in the Gulf continued to rise. The key players knew that a misstep now could lead to a conflict that was no longer contained to the region. What began as a malfunctioning military plane in the skies had set off a chain of events that would redefine the future of warfare. The entire world watched, waiting for the next move in this high-stakes game where the line between peace and war was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish. As the days passed, the geopolitical atmosphere in the Gulf became increasingly charged. While the world watched with a mixture of fascination and fear, the focus shifted from the military hardware to the digital front lines. The cyber attack on the C-17 had opened a Pandora's box of possibilities, and now the global superpowers were playing a dangerous game of digital espionage. While the United States had made its show of force with the B-2 bombers, it was clear that the true battle was no longer confined to the skies. Military and intelligence agencies were now engaged in a silent war, an information and cyber warfare conflict that had the potential to change the very nature of international relations. The C-17 incident had illuminated a chilling vulnerability in the U.S. military's infrastructure. The failure of the plane's GPS system was a direct result of a highly sophisticated cyber attack, one that had crippled one of the most essential components of military aviation. The realization that such an attack could be carried out remotely sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. If an adversary could hijack the flight path of an aircraft so easily, what other military assets might be vulnerable? The United States military had invested billions into its technological advancements, yet here was a stark reminder that these systems were not invincible. The attack was seen by many as a test. The implications were undeniable. The digital battlefield had become as important as the traditional one. With the rise of cyber warfare, nation-states now had access to powerful tools that could destabilize an adversary's military without ever firing a shot. Iran's potential role in the attack seemed increasingly likely, and the question became not whether the U.S. would retaliate, but when and how. While military experts and political strategists worked around the clock to craft a response, one thing became clear. This was no longer just a regional conflict. It was a global issue, and the international community was now firmly in the crosshairs. As tensions mounted, diplomatic channels remained open, though the situation was increasingly fragile. U.S. allies, especially those with a vested interest in the stability of the Gulf, were growing concerned. The potential for miscommunication and escalation was high, and the absence of a clear diplomatic resolution only fueled the uncertainty. Behind closed doors, negotiations were underway to defuse the situation, but both the U.S. and Iran were entrenched in their positions. Iran had made it clear that it would not back down in the face of American aggression. while the United States was firm in its stance that it would not allow its military capabilities to be compromised. What was most concerning to military leaders was the lack of clarity on how to respond to a cyber attack of this magnitude. Retaliation in the form of traditional military strikes risked triggering a full-scale war. Yet doing nothing was not an option either. As the U.S. scrambled to develop a response, the world waited with bated breath. The clock was ticking, and each passing day without a resolution brought the risk of further escalation. The digital age had given rise to new kinds of warfare, and the question now was whether the world would be able to navigate this new, uncharted territory without plunging into chaos. The uncertainty loomed over every decision, every military maneuver, and every diplomatic effort. The world had never been this close to the brink, and yet the outcome was still anyone's guess. The moment of reckoning arrived unexpectedly, a sharp break from the tense buildup that had gripped the world for so many days. As the diplomatic channels continued to buzz with frantic calls and back-channel communications, a new development came to light. A cyber counterattack unlike anything previously attempted had been launched. The U.S. had unleashed a cyber strike against Iranian military infrastructure, targeting their key communications and military command centers. The attack was swift and devastating, designed not only to disrupt Iran's ability to respond but to send a powerful message. The United States would no longer tolerate this kind of aggression. It wasn't a traditional airstrike, but it was every bit as impactful in the digital age. The Iranian government, having anticipated some form of retaliation, scrambled to protect its cyber infrastructure, but it was already too late. The U.S. had shown its digital might, and now the world watched as Iran began to pick up the pieces of a fractured system. The damage was extensive, but it was not the end of the story. The counterattack triggered a volatile reaction, one that neither side fully understood. While the U.S. had successfully crippled Iran's cyber capabilities for a time, it had also set the stage for a new kind of retaliatory strike, one that blurred the lines between warfare and diplomacy. The Iranian response was not immediate, but it would come, and it would likely be in the form of another cyber attack, one that could target critical U.S. infrastructure, including power grids, communication networks, and financial institutions. On the global stage, countries began to realize the magnitude of what had just occurred. This wasn't just a regional conflict. This was the first true test of modern cyber warfare between two world powers. Nations that had long been wary of the growing reliance on digital systems began to rethink their own defense strategies. The U.S. had taken a calculated risk, but in doing so, it had shown the world that cyber warfare could potentially disrupt everything from military operations to everyday life. What had started as a single aircraft malfunction had evolved into an unprecedented conflict, one that had blurred the lines between war and peace. In Tehran, the government was still reeling from the U.S. attack. While some officials considered escalating with traditional military means, others, knowing how precarious the situation was, argued for restraint. They feared that further escalation would leave their country vulnerable to a much stronger and more capable adversary. Iran, too, was now trapped in a corner, unable to back down without losing face, but unwilling to escalate too far for fear of triggering a much larger, uncontrollable conflict. As the dust settled and the digital battles continued in the background, the rest of the world waited for the next move. The situation in the Gulf had fundamentally shifted. While a full-scale military war had been averted, for now, this new chapter of global conflict had left behind a haunting truth. The age of traditional warfare was waning, replaced by an invisible digital war with far-reaching implications. For the first time in history, nations could wage war from the comfort of a desk, their weapons no longer bombs and guns, but lines of code and algorithms. And in this new world, no one was truly safe. The game had changed, and there was no turning.